I mean, I think just to add on to what Elliot was just saying, I think that
We're going to ask and answer our own questions.
okay.
Just stay out of this.
I mean, if there's other questions, let's take them. Then I'll just add on to what Elliot was saying in response to the question.
Here we have one, Max.
You know, it seems one of the themes we're talking about is the age-old battle between liberty and tyranny. And, you know, to use an old phrase, hearts and minds, that, you know, liberty lives in the hearts and minds of people who want to be free. And I wondered if you could comment a little bit on how belief in God, or maybe respect for creation or the mystery of creation, relates to the discourse that you've been describing.
After you, Alphonse.
You wanted to add on, so.
Yeah. I have to think about that before I can add on.
Bill Buckley used to say that questions like Peking duck requires 24 hours notice. But, so I think what you do is your best, and you give people behind various iron curtains courage. You let them know they're supportive, even if they can't speak up in their time and place. You give them support regardless. And you may find out whom you've reached later, after walls come down. I mean, the thanks that Robert Conquest got in the former Soviet Union when he went there, I could tell many stories about this, but my favorite story is a man knew he was there and walked up to him on the street, without saying a word, handed him a rose and walked away. This man just knew he was Conquest. Richard Pipes has had similar experiences. And I believe in the Middle East that names like Bernard Lewis and Fuad Ajami will be greatly honored, and other names we can think of in Middle East studies will be greatly dishonored. And I like a lot of us, I attend my share of Middle Eastern conferences, and the people I meet there are liberals. I mean, in the old sense, they might as well be fellows at AEI. And people say, oh, those are just a few of the Western educated people. Well, a lot of people are Western educated, including a lot of mass murdering terrorists. And these people do stand for something. And I think you mentioned 48%. 47% was the magic number in the American campaign. You mentioned 48% in Egypt.
Yes.
Well, they ought to be acknowledged by the likes of us, meaning the U.S. government and our society.
Yeah, and I would just add on and say that I think it is a mistake that, some people commit to see the war against groups like Al-Qaeda as being a war of religions. Ours, whether it's whatever your religion might be, versus Islam. I don't think that's the case at all, because I don't think these extremists speak for a very large number of Muslims. And I think what you're really seeing is a civil war within the Muslim world that's going on. It's not a war, and I think Samuel Huntington was wrong. This is not a war of cultures. This is a war within cultures, and it's really a war within the Muslim culture between those who have different interpretations of what Islam commands. And certainly there are radical extremists, but they are generally not winning their way through the ballot box. They generally win their way through violence and keep power at gunpoint. And even when they do manage to win at the ballot box, you see, in the case of Egypt, for example, with the Morsi government trying to change the rules to make it very hard to evict it from power. But on the other hand, you also see, as was Elliot alluded to earlier, you see tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people rallying in Tahrir Square to oppose that power grab. And there's no question that, for example, in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood won the election that was held fair and square, but I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that the opposition was so ill-organized. There was a lot of opposition. They just did not have the kind of organizational structure that the Muslim Brotherhood had. And the Muslim Brotherhood was winning not on an appeal of imposing Iranian-style Sharia law. It was winning basically on a bread and butter appeal of trying to revive the Egyptian economy, get people back to work. It was really tapping into the daily concerns that ordinary voters have all over the world. And unfortunately, you may well have situations, and you will have situations where radical extremist groups can hijack polities such as in Egypt or in Libya or Syria or elsewhere, where you don't have a strong pushback. And that's what I'm suggesting we and our allies in the West need to help provide, is to provide support to these brave liberals and moderates in the Muslim world who do want to push back, but just need the tools to be able to do so.
I'll try and answer to that question about God and liberty. I think it goes to the idea that in the concept of God that we have in the Judeo and Christian approach, there is a soul, that each individual has a soul. And that means that each individual is an individual. There are no two souls alike. And that's the basis for equality. Because that means no matter how strong you are, how bright you are, how rich you are, it doesn't matter. You got a soul, I've got a soul, we're equals in that sense. And if that's the case, then you have to have liberty, because the individual, there's nothing like that individual's own decision. You're the decision maker, and that gets into the economics of things that we talk about at the Buckley Forum. So that's the source of liberty when it comes from religion. If you have a religion where the ideology of the regime takes over the religion, that ideology erases the individuality of the soul. And therefore you don't have liberty. We have time for one last question.
I'm going to rely on you guys to add precision to my question, but I sense that there is a continuity or similarity in some of the issues that Chambers' experience in life raises and some of the things that we're seeing today. I've been struck in particular about when Chambers first went to the State Department. It wasn't an issue of people not believing him, but of people downplaying the significance of what he said. And, you know, Professor Hill loves to talk about important news being put in the back pages of the New York Times. So it seems like a lot of the time it's not an issue of belief or disbelief, but on how much emphasis we put on various pieces of information or people put. And Jay talked about people putting a lot of emphasis on a bombing in Baghdad and less emphasis on a liberal voice that we might hear in the Middle East. The same thing I think we're seeing with Susan Rice in Benghazi, where people are saying, okay, she might have done it, sure, but it's not important. So how do we prioritize information to make sure that we're seeing the world correctly or events in the world correctly? It seems like that's an issue that was relevant then and also now.
One piece of good news is that since 9/11, a lot of people have become very, very interested in the Middle East, and they never were before. They were forced to become interested in the Middle East. Not long ago, I asked Professor Lewis, who was born in 1916, there were very, very few people in the West studying the Middle East or anywhere when he was. Did you ever think that your field would become so important, that there'd be such interest in your field? He said, no, never. And that's good news. There are lots of people who know about the Middle East and lots of different outlets. By the way, this is Eliana Johnson of National Review and Yale University. And so there are groups like MEMRI, the Middle East Media Research Institute, that translates materials from the Middle East, a group that lets you know what's being said there, what's on television, what sermons in mosque are, what school curricula are, what entertainment television shows are. And they're shining a light on the Middle East. And we don't have to rely now on just a few sources or just a few outlets. There are plenty of people who've been struck by curiosity about the Middle East. I think of this Michael Totten, an independent journalist who has devoted his life to finding out about the Middle East. Now, it's all because of necessity. We didn't ask for it. It used to be very, very few people knew about the Middle East and knew the various groups. Whoever gave a thought to Kurds, for example? Who? But this is, as I said, we used to know a heck of a lot about South Africa. And now that knowledge has faded, at least in me. And now we're experts or semi-experts on the Middle East, and about what region next, who knows?
I think, what you're saying in essence is we screen information. The first answer to your question is stop reading the New York Times, which much more than it used to 10 or even 10.
But if I
certainly
stop
20.
reading it, well, what do I have to write about anymore with my commentary?
Well,
blog post?
there is that problem, but because there's a sort of classic effort to say what is important and what is unimportant in accordance with an ideological scheme. You know, I don't think there's an answer to this, and it's very hard to get people to jump out of that sort of, in the case of the Times, liberal left view of the world, except over a long period of time by pointing out cognitive dissonance and discrepancies and so forth. I guess it's easier now in the sense that Charlie and I were at the State Department. I remember work stopped at 6:30 to watch Cronkite and Brokaw. Mm-hmm. Their interpretation of the news was critical for the U.S. government. Likewise, Time and Newsweek. Time and Newsweek don't matter. Newsweek is gone. And then we now have, pardon me, we now have, you know, many more news broadcasts, and we have the internet. So if we could just get rid of the New York Times, the problem would be about 25% solved. And I actually am serious about that because of its influence on media elites throughout the country who look at it to determine how to understand the world.